It is my pleasure to announce to you our keynote this morning, Chairman Lyle Larson, Chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. Let's give him a big round of applause. Chairman. And this is, thank you so much. Here is your clicker, just back and forth.
Okay.
And you've got a glass of water if you need it.
Okay, that's
and you're going to be pointing
I just need, just turn that one. There you go. Just leave it on. Thank you. If I can get this thing off. Yeah. Hey, good morning. Texas water. If you look at that drought map and you look at the water data comparing 2011 to last year to this year, that should scare all of us. You know, from the standpoint of the vulnerability of our state, just sitting 6, 8, 10 weeks without any precipitation, we start feeling it, and I know y'all are feeling it. 56% of all the water used in Texas is groundwater, and of that 56%, 70% of that water is used for irrigation. Contrast that with surface water. If you look at the 42%, 47% of that's used for municipal use, 30% of it's used for irrigation. So it should tell you that the problem we have is, like every nation, especially in the arid areas of the world, they used all their groundwater before they rely completely on surface water. And so y'all are the folks that are protecting the groundwater for future generations. So we can't think in contemporary terms. We got to think about sustainability as a state. And so I see y'all as a valuable resource to protect the interest of property owners, but also for future generations. We had a year ago, I think all of us were probably watching the TV screen and watching the Weather Channel as we saw this huge storm formulating off of the Florida coast, and then it came into the Gulf of Mexico. Everybody's trying to figure out where it was going to make landfall, and then it hit. And for 5 days, we had the largest rainfall event in the history of North America. What did we do with that water? What happened? I mean, if you look at it, I use it as an example. Some of y'all heard me talk. It was the largest organic desalination project in the history of the world. 34 trillion gallons of water that was treated. The salt was left behind, and it came over Texas, and it dropped all that water. It would cost multiple billions of dollars to treat that much water, to making it fresh, to take it out of the Gulf. Mother Nature gave it to us, and then we let it recede back to the coastline. I know Ken Kramer and some of the other folks said, well, we need to flush the Gulf of Mexico. Well, I think we gave all those basin estuaries the biggest flush they've ever had in their lives. And we could have scalped, a fraction of that water and stored it somewhere down the line we could access it, but we lost it. All that fresh water is gone. Think about your particular aquifers that y'all manage, and how you're gonna rue the day we didn't capture some of that water, and we could have used it for future use. What are we going to do about flooding? And that's going to be the preoccupation of the legislature, is the whole aftermath of Harvey and dealing with the flood control element of it. And there has to be a water storage part of this solution. We're going to go in, and the local jurisdictions, they can't pay for it. The $2.5 billion that the Harris County folks, they stepped up and they supported. I think the voters passed it at 85% approval. Well, if you look at all the flooding that happens in Harris County, but you go from Beaumont to Brownsville, and you look when we have a 8, 10, 12-inch rainfall episode, we've had 3 of those in the last 2 years between Beaumont and Houston, and you saw all the flooding that occurred. So when people go, well, you can't account for a 50-inch rainfall event in 5 days. You can account for 8, 10, and 12 inches because they're happening more frequently than we ever anticipated. In our floodplains, the way they were set up in 100-year floodplains, we're having a 100-year floodplain about every 8 months. In a 100-year flood, about every 8 months in this state right now. So we need to recalculate, how we look at the FEMA maps in the floodplain management. It's just ironic that we're here with the floodplain management people, because if you look at what their task is to do, is we're going to have to reassess all that. There's so much more water, and the volume as well as the velocity of the water, and trying to contain that a lot of the drainage projects that have been built over the last 3 decades, they're inadequate. And so we're going to have to figure out, when we go in and we start building those flood control projects, the state needs to be sort of the broker of creating regionalization. And I think the river authorities are probably the best equipped from the standpoint of working with all jurisdictions in running some kind of regional flood management program. And the state, you take the Corps money, you take the county and the city's money, and the state would be would fill the gap in. Good example is up in East Texas. There's a project, I believe it's outside of Orange, that the Corps came in with about $1 billion. The local match is $660 million. The county budget is $45 million. So how does that work? They got to pay for all of the services that are being rendered by that county, and they're supposed to pay the $660 million to get a project that protects not only communities, but very important infrastructure in our state. The refineries that were shut down during Harvey, we lost about 25% of the refining capacity in the United States because they were flooded. There's 4 and 5 foot of water sitting in refineries in Port Arthur and Baytown and in other areas along the Texas coast. Well, that had an impact on everybody in this room. We couldn't get gasoline. And it stretched not only a week, but in Central Texas, it went as long as 3 weeks before we could get we were confident we could go to a gas station and get gasoline. So that had a profound impact on our economy. Who's responsible for that? Well, I think all government entities are. If there's a way that we can control the flooding in and around important assets like that as a state, then the state needs to get involved. So I'm advocating that we take about $4 billion out of the rainy day fund, and we become the multiplier in flood control. That we would go in and we would fill that gap between what that county is responsible for, what the Corps is willing to give if the match is met, and then create the regionalization in flood management by deploying the river authorities. And San Antonio is a great example. I know there's some people here from Sarah and some of the entities here in San Antonio, but that's a great example. San Antonio River Authority, they lead, and then the county and the city and all the jurisdictions within Bexar County, they cooperated. They prioritized the flood control projects, and then they built them out, and they've all thrown in, and they were able to access Corps funding as well as working with the Water Development Board and other entities as far as accessing it. So I think that there's a big number there. The folks with the Water Development Board, I know John, we've met with him and Jeff in talking about the flood assessment that they're doing right now. It's basically an aggregation of all the flooding projects or flood mitigation projects across the state, and they were able to try to get us a number. Somewhere between 60 and $70 billion is what that number is. And that doesn't account for all jurisdictions because some didn't really have an assessment of their own. So that's a long-term problem. So you'll hear a lot of that discussion. As far as direct impact for folks here, A lot of the same bills are going to come back. Desalination, there's been a lot of good work done by the Water Development Board assessing some of the aquifers. We need to continue to work with the oil and gas industry and other folks as far as the brackets around those highly productive zones so we can expand them a little bit more so it becomes more viable logistically for some of the population centers to access these areas. But looking at that map and understanding that if this continues, you're going to see a lot more development in desalination. And y'all should embrace it. I mean, it takes the pressure off the fresh water that y'all are responsible for. And I know I know Ty's around here somewhere. I know that's a big part of what you guys do out there. And then some other folks, they're looking at it. I know, Kathy, y'all have looked extensively in that aquifer. What is that funny sounding aquifer? Yeah, the Catahoula. I love that. I mean, we should have more aquifers named the Catahoula. I mean, that's so much cooler than the Trinity. You know, they're just more. There's just it sounds a lot cooler. So we're gonna go through that. We've got a funding issue that was created out of the governor's office. We need an extra $2 million to study to help facilitate and accelerate the studies that we've got going on with the aquifers, and hopefully we can get it done and then hand the data over and help foster the development of some desal plants. We're way behind in developing the desal or the brackish desal plants in relation to some of the other states. And hopefully we'll expedite that with regulatory controls and accessing the information. The other issue is the aquifer storage and recovery, and every time I say that, I want to look at Alan, you know. Alan, we've worked with Alan and other folks on this issue. We met with TCEQ last week, and there's a transition right now when we lost Mr. McGuire and Charles has gone on to the EPA. There's great opportunity. And going back to that storm, can you imagine if we had the ability to capture some of that water and store hundreds of thousands of acres of water in the Gulf Coast Aquifer and in the Crezo-Wilcox, or all the ones that were impacted within 100 miles of the coastline? Just makes all the sense in the world. And looking at Florida, they've been very aggressive. They're looking at a sort of a Manhattan type of project with ASR of storing 1.7 billion gallons of water that's on a daily basis, under the Everglades, 300 injection wells that they're going to put in. And they've worked through a lot of the issues that a lot of the folks in this room in dealing with floodwaters, the ecotoxicity of that water, of trying to figure out how you treat it so it doesn't denigrate the water that you have existing in the aquifers. I think that we've got to think like that. We got to think big. We're Texas, and we're still thinking from a water standpoint. We need to think about some of the big projects that are out there, and it's going to take about 3 years of that where it's intense red, and then all of a sudden, I think the leadership in our state's going to start thinking about water again. How many times in any of the governor's speeches, lieutenant governor's speeches, or most of the folks running for office do they talk about water? They don't talk about it until it's too late. And so I think it's critical that we ratchet up the importance of water planning and having the state get involved, because I think from the standpoint of the Water Development Board, they've done a kick-ass job with the SWIFT. They've helped facilitate building out $5.3 billion worth of projects, and we've got a lot of folks that are accessing that. But the reality is, I think there's some other opportunities where the state would lead. Little historical background, you look at the drought of the 1950s, the state used state participation fund money, and they were sort of the conduit in developing a lot of the large reservoirs that we've got in our state. 66% of our surface water was in response to the drought of the 1950s. What are we going to do about the drought of 2011 and whatever the next drought that's going to hit us? And I think the state's got to take more of a leadership role. We can't follow. We can't wait for folks to do this on their own initiative. It's going to have to be done where the state has a thoughtful, deliberate process, and we don't just put it in a water plan and say somebody's going to build this. We hope that it's a river authority, or we hope that it's a public utility. I think the state needs to say we're going to build it, and our partners will be whoever needs the water. And I think that's how a lot of the other states do it, and that's how we did it in the 1950s. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue. I'm anxious. I want to create urgency, but it's very difficult to do that when people's reservoirs are full. And people look at that and they think that they're good. The problem is, and looking at this map, in 6 months we could be in a severely difficult position. If our surface water continues to decline through evaporation, then it's going to come back to y'all. I would like to thank all of y'all for coming to San Antonio. I hope that y'all visited the Lazy River. The Lazy River Authority, I think, is the people that are responsible for that. And I don't want to say, I know Satterwhite's here, and he's probably going, no, we're not lazy. But I really appreciate y'all coming to San Antonio, and I'd be open to answering any questions if you have any. Thank y'all very much. Morning.
Okay. Good morning. Linda K. Rogers, Hayes Trinity Groundwater Conservation District. GCDs are mandated to preserve and protect the aquifers, and that's not just quantity, but also quality. And when the quality is impaired, the quantity is decreased. Increasingly, we are seeing discharge permits into the streams and rivers, into areas that are going into the aquifer and therefore contaminating the aquifer. Do you see anything happening with changes with the TCEQ, that there's more than discharge or TLAP permits, that reuse permits could become more, because some people are applying, they have to apply for one or the other, and they're applying for these discharge permits, and they're really going to do some use, or they're just looking for the easy way out and they want to discharge into a local stream or river.
What area do you represent?
Hayes Trinity, Western Hayes County.
Trinity, yeah, that bill came up last session, and we discussed it. The issue is, and I understand the pristine nature of the hill country and the importance to protect it. The in-stream flow of the Trinity River is primarily coming out of the discharges from the wastewater plants out of Dallas. And you look at the bed-to-banks legislation. If we didn't have those return flows, most of our rivers would be compromised immediately, especially in the conditions we're in right now, where you don't have a lot of tributaries feeding into them. And you can look at all the big rivers, and the return flows are important. It's difficult, and I know Tracy King laid that bill out in our committee, and he talked about it, and we had a lot of compelling testimony about people saying, we don't want, I think it was the Dripping Springs, or there was a couple of communities that were looking at releasing water into those streams. How do you allow it in certain parts of the state, and it's the primary conveyance that we have going into Livingston as the Trinity and a number of the other rivers that are making up the lion's share of municipal water. I don't know how you would say, well, in this part of the state, we're not going to allow return flows, but in the other parts, it's a necessity, and so it's a sort of a contradiction. Hopefully, the EPA and the standards that TCEQ looks on the return flows, they meet or exceed the standards that they're required. And if there's a compromise on that, then obviously we need to be all over that. But I just don't, I would love to hear your comments about how you do it in the Hill Country, but you don't do it anywhere else in the state.
Well, I would comment on one thing is that our area gets no recharge from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Scientifically, it's shown that our discharge comes more locally, our recharge comes more locally, and that would be our local rivers, but it's not just the rivers and streams, because the aquifer provides the stream flow to those rivers and creeks. So there's an interconnection there. But where you've got a losing branch of a river, we know that almost always goes straight into the aquifer. So I think there has to be some separation and understanding that the aquifers throughout the state differ. They're not alike. Some are connected, some are not. And looking more science maybe is what's needed, but to understand that the recharge areas vary for aquifer, and even within my own district, we have several different recharge areas.
Yeah.
So I think it could be done, and if nothing, at least put in reuse permits. Allow reuse permits at some percentage or all, so that there is that option, and wastewater discharge does not have to be either TLAP or discharge, that there is at least that other option that should be available without.
I imagine we'll see that bill again. I can
so.
tell by your passion. So it's going to be difficult again to tell certain parts of the state that rely on those return flows, and then other folks. There's a lot of ranchers that need the water in those streams for their livestock and for their domestic use, and so it's a big issue. So thank you very much for your perspective. Thank you all very much.